De aquella viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
What's up, everybody, to episode 47, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Today, we're talking about the People's Republic of China, socialism with Chinese characteristics, in defense of the CPC, in defense of the Chinese people against empire, against imperialism, against capitalism and neocolonialism, and against the fake leftists who try to claim that China is hegemonic, that try to justify imperialist war against China. And today's guests are my good comrades, Carlos Garrido and Edward Liger Smith. Carlos is a Cuban-American philosophy graduate student and instructor at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. His research focuses on Marxism, Hegel, and Early 19th Century U.S. Socialism. He is an editor and co-founder of Midwestern Marx and the Journal of American Socialist Studies. Please subscribe to Midwestern Marx. Their link is in the description. And also, please check out the Journal of American Socialist Studies. The link is also in the description as well. Amazing content. How's it going, Carlos?
I'm doing very well, comrade. Happy to be here. As I said last time I was on, I absolutely love your show. So I'm very glad to be back, and now with my brother, Eddie Liger.
Most definitely. And last but not least, comrade Eddie Liger. Y'all have seen him. He has some funny-ass TikTok videos that have me cracking up, but also inform me about socialism. Eddie Liger Smith is an American political scientist and specialist in anti-imperialist and socialist projects, especially Venezuela. He also has research interests in the role of that Southern slavery played in the development of American and European capitalism. He is currently a graduate student, assistant, and wrestling coach at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. He is an editor and co-founder of Midwestern Marx and the Journal of American Socialist Studies, which, again, the links are in the description. How's it going, Comrade Eddie?
I'm doing good, Ramiro. Thank you for the kind introduction there. We're both happy to be back with you again.
No worries. And Eddie has some great content videos. I think one of my favorite things about those little short videos is that they're tailored to the next generation of youth. Me personally, I'll be honest with y'all, I'm not on TikTok. I'm not good with that short form kind of content, but y'all kill it with that and are doing a great job. And that's important because the Gen Zers are going to be the next generation leading society, and we have to begin educating them about socialism, communism, and in a way that defends the anti-imperialist nations, in a way that defends what actually exists in the world today, and not just what we're against. So I think that's something that you guys do a great job of: optimistic socialism, constructive socialism, and not just whining about what's going on in capitalism. So you guys are doing a great job. So basically what I wanted to do is, a lot of the content you guys put out, especially on China, I think is really great, because one of the misconceptions that I grew up hearing as I became radicalized is that China is no longer socialist. China is now imperialist. China is capitalist, that it's an empire, that it's just going to replace the US. And I hear it from both the liberals and the conservatives here in the US. It's something that I think people agree upon within these false two-party system. And I think it's something that many people just really don't understand. Me and my girlfriend in 2019 had the opportunity to travel to China and actually experience China for ourselves, speak with people, tour the country. We went to this small village named Jiganshan, where the Chinese Revolution, the birthplace of the Chinese Revolution and the Long March. And it was just a very beautiful experience to see the generational development of the Chinese people. You had grandparents, 80, 90, 100 years old, who in their day had never even had electricity and running water. And everybody was addicted to opiates during the century of humiliation before the Chinese Revolution. And now you have their grandchildren going into space, developing technology that doesn't even exist, high-tech industry, lifting millions of people out of poverty in such a short period of time. You can see even within one family unit, like a grandparent who saw pre-revolutionary China, a parent who saw some of the rough times that China went through in the 70s, and now the younger generation that is just excelling and doing an amazing job at lifting China out of poverty. And for me, that was really eye-opening, a really beautiful experience. And I just think in general, a lot of the Western left does not understand China, does not take the time or have the respect to understand that if China and the Communist Party of China is calling itself socialist, is calling itself communist, you have to respect that and study that, and not just write them off as, oh, they're revisionist or they're capitalist or this or that. Maybe we can start off with you, compañero Carlos. Your thoughts on, like, what is China? What is your response to people who claim that China is capitalist and imperialist? And what has been your political transformation in terms of educating yourself about China?
Well, in terms of my transformation, I started studying China about a year and a half ago. I grabbed after Eddie had recommended it, The Governance of China, and I read through most of Volume 1, and I followed articles and stuff, but it really wasn't until like a few months ago where I really decided that we're heading full blown into a new Cold War, and we have a Western left that denigrates China and that has the same sentiments as the empire. So I think my duty as an intellectual, as a militant, is to inform myself about the revolutionary processes in China, and as a philosopher, also to inform myself of how it is that the Chinese project, through Mao, through Deng, and now through Xi, have been able to contribute to the Marxist project. So I'm still in the process of doing that, and it's fascinating. It has its difficulties because, I mean, it's not like learning about German history or something. You're seeing names that you're not used to seeing. There's no point of reference to bring it back to, so there's a difficulty there with the language. But I'm completely enjoying, learning new words about, what the words that they use for like Westerners categorizing or thinking about China with Western categories. So they have these great conceptual developments going on over there. But in terms of China and how to classify it, I think that there's a comrade from the Communist Party of Britain that did an article a while back that just from the title itself, he categorizes it correctly, from the continuity of the Chinese Revolution, because it has been a continuous process that has taken many twists and turns, but it has been a continuous process with the aim of continuing to solidify sovereignty and to improve the lives of the masses. I think that the Western left has, in part, they have shared the narrative of the imperialist class that China has moved towards capitalism, specifically in the process of reform and opening up in 1978, because they accepted the bifurcation, the dichotomy, the split that comes from von Mises, that it's either socialism or market economy. And that's not true. And what Chinese scholarship has shown in their investigation of socialist market economies, which they also base themselves off of similar experiments in Yugoslavia. But what they've shown is that the market is an institutional form which has existed in various ways in different societies, even in societies that were not yet mediated by class antagonisms. They had markets that would work in a collective fashion, where one community would go and trade with another community. And the founder of economic anthropology, Karl Polanyi, talked about this a lot. So it's not anything that's new. We know that markets have existed in previous historical epochs, and Marx did too, right? And specifically towards the latter part of Volume 3 of Capital, he talks about some pre-capitalist formations, and he describes the markets in ancient Greece and the markets in Rome, and he describes after how markets would function in feudal Europe. And what he notices is that according to how the relations of production are set up, the market functions for the ends of those relations, right? So what the Chinese have done is categorize through what they call contradiction analysis, which is really just dialectics, traditional dialectics. You could see it as far back as Hegel. They make a distinction between the universal and the particular. They realize that the universal always manifests itself through the particular, and what that means is that they're looking at the market as an institutional form that has existed throughout various moments in history, throughout various epochs, and so they classify it as a universal institutional form that in order to exist, it has to exist in a particular mode of life. So in particular relations and a mode of production. So a market is not equal to capitalism. And what they have found is that if it has existed before capitalism, it could probably exist after capitalism. And they've used since 78 the market in a socialistic fashion in order to develop themselves. And I mean, the numbers are just absolutely staggering. I have in front of me a statistic from John Ross, who's a beast. I love his work. But from 1978 to 2020, China's economy has grown by 3,914%.
Wow. Damn.
Compared to 231% for the US, and the world average was 180%. So we're talking just a ridiculous amount of growth that has been generated by their socialist market economy, which is oriented, which is people-centered and people-oriented. So the goal of the market is not private accumulation of capital in the hands of a few, but to use capital to manipulate it so that it can function for the common good and raise people's living standards. And they've done that, and it's just undeniable that they've done a tremendous job with it. You know, as Marxists, we approach the world scientifically. We're not dogmatists. And what China has continuously done is propose new hypotheses of dealing with the world when new problems show up. And the end of those hypotheses have been to raise the living standard of people. And what we found with the reform and opening up process and the deepening of those reforms is that they have worked. The proof is in the conditions that China has today. And it's also in the conditions of fear that it creates within the empire, right? This whole new Cold War wouldn't be happening if China wouldn't have been as successful as it's been in creating growth and in, you know, having an influence in the global sphere because of their win-win relationship. They've grown without having to do what the West has done, which is, you know, genocide natives, enslave black folks, and colonize the world. They haven't done that, and they've been able to develop friendly relationships with the world while developing themselves. And yeah, I don't want to go on for too.
Yeah. Well said. I a lot of people have suggested John Ross's book, so I definitely got to check that out. And I definitely agree, and I like what you said about understanding Marxism as a science and not as a dogmatic religion. I find that in my conversations with a lot of quote unquote Maoists, they fetishize the revolutionary era of China, 1949, 1969, the Cultural Revolution, where, like, when you go to China, like when I spoke to people out there and just people from China in general, they say that the 70s and the late stage of the Cultural Revolution were actually some of the harshest days of their existence in China, and that their favorite era of China is today, is construction, is the lifting of millions of people out of poverty. And I find that a lot of times some of people who are young and new, and I include myself in this too, people, they see the guns, they see the guerrillas in the countryside, and they kind of get stuck in that. They get stuck in that and just fetishize it without understanding that the most exciting part of a revolution is serving the people, lifting millions of people out of poverty. And I think that that you said that very well, Carlos. But maybe turning to you, Comrade Eddie, your experience with what was your political transformation in terms of studying China, and what is your response to people who claim that China is capitalist and imperialist and just as bad as the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So when I became a socialist in 2020, you know, I wasn't pro-China or anything. You know, I just kind of got told about Marxism, thought it made a lot of sense, and began studying it. But then once I started to study Marxism a little deeper, I began to see the disconnect between what the Western left thinks that Marxism is versus what it actually is. And that Marxism is both pretty specific in its principles and in its method of analysis, but it's also very flexible, right? And it can be adapted. The whole, you know, that's part of the beauty of dialectical and historical materialism. So I was reading Capital then that year, and I was super, super curious about China, because I was like, here's this socialist country. I'm now a socialist, and everybody on the left in the US seems to hate them, and I don't understand why. And I don't understand how a country with capitalist markets and billionaires could be socialist. So I, you know, just decided to do my best to apply the Marxist method to China, to understand them historically and materially. So that's when I got that book, The Governance of China by Xi Jinping, and Carlos and I read it. And this is simultaneously as I was reading Capital for the first time, and I began to see, like, what China is doing is genius, right? And it's nothing like what it's portrayed as in the U.S. As you know, none of the anti-imperialist countries are portrayed correctly in the U.S. media, obviously. But I began to see this really ingenious process of developing socialism, and since then, I've just done my best to deepen my understanding of China. And when you do look at them historically and materially, and you see what they've been able to construct in the past 70 years, it's completely incredible. So you have Carlos talking about the different forms that markets can take. So a lot of people just assume that China's market sector works exactly like the US's markets. It is not the case. First of all, the opening up and the allowing of markets and foreign capital into China that took place under Deng would have been entirely impossible without the policies of Mao, without the industrial base that was laid by Mao and the people of China during that period was what allowed for foreign capital to come in and create some market sectors on top of that industrial base. And we talk about, you know, the transition from feudalism into, or, you know, the transition out of feudalism that happened under Mao. And again, Westerners have no conception of what that even means. They have no idea what it's like to live in a feudal, you know, agrarian or society. And you have Americans talking about free Tibet as if before the Communist Party, Tibet wasn't a place with horrible, oppressive slavery, you know, and serfdom and exploitation of the countryside that was destroyed by the Communist Party and replaced, you know, with what we see today. And when you compare China's transition out of feudalism, like, yeah, there were a lot of mistakes that were made during that period and during the Cultural Revolution. But look at what, you know, how Europe transitioned out of feudalism, or look at how, you know, America was founded as a bourgeois society. It took basically slavery on a mass scale, you know, to enrich these societies and enrich these capitalists who would eventually become the ruling class of capitalism in Europe and in the U.S. So if you want to compare how brutal the transitions out of feudalism were in the U.S. and Europe, they were absolutely horrific, murderous, and built on the backs of slaves, whereas China was able to industrialize without doing that and create this sort of base for their economy, which has been added to by the reforms and has been added to by 50 years of continued struggle for constructing socialism. And the other thing that happens when you study China is you see that there's a debate always within the party. Historically, there is always a debate going on as to what the next step forward should be. When you know, and in the U.S. media, it's compared as, you know, this sort of, whoops, I just knocked over my mic, as this sort of top-down society, you know, where Xi Jinping is somehow making all the decisions for a country of millions and millions of people. But in reality, there's this constant debate between academics and intellectuals as to what the best path forward is. You know, where in the U.S. we have these a handful of tech and crony capitalists who basically run our entire society. So it's an entirely different society than the U.S. or than any other neoliberal capitalist country. You know, there is a process of constructing socialism there. And it's just a matter of whether Western leftists are going to take the time to learn about it or not.
Yeah, definitely. I like that you mentioned the stereotypes about China and Chinese socialism, because one of the things that I find a lot is that a lot of the Western leftists who sort of pick up where Trotsky left off in terms of fetishizing Western European and North American socialism and looking down at Eastern and Asiatic, you know, what he would call Asiatic socialism, is that they view people in the East as having a, quote, hive mind. They're all brainwashed. They all just follow the same propaganda. They don't think for themselves. And it alludes to kind of like this racist history of how people in the West view Asians and Chinese people in particular, without understanding, like you said, Eddie, that there's so many internal debates happening within the CPC. People tend to view the CPC very monolithically. They think that it's just Xi Jinping calling out the shots and that's it. There's no debate, but there's so many debates that go on within the CPC. And I think their model of democratic centralism, unity, diversity in discussion and unity in action is something that people in the West have no idea to understand. Even the left, like people in the US left in particular, they are not able to understand that it's okay. You can disagree with people on certain things, but you can still unite with them and work with them and not have to completely fall apart. And I think the Chinese people understand the importance of unity and how it can be used to defend yourself against an enemy. I'm also glad you mentioned the case of Tibet, and which we're going to talk about later on, Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, because I think a lot of people in the West fetishize and don't understand some of the oppressive groups that exist. In the case of Tibet, the Dalai Lamas, the horrible feudal system that existed in Tibet, and especially in the 40s, the CIA airlifted weapons and instruction manuals on how to overthrow the Chinese government for many years. There's some book, I think it's called like Journey to Tibet or something like that, that kind of alludes to some of this stuff. And the Tibetans, the reactionary Tibetans had horrible systems. The Dalai Lamas would violate young girls. They would make them into quote unquote concubines. They weren't allowed to go to school. They were repressive against people who they considered as lower class. They had a very hierarchical system that even the Nazis were obsessed with the Tibetans and how they structured their society in terms of these caste systems. So that's something that a lot of people in the West, these like Western soy liberal people who are like, oh my God, the Tibetans are so progressive. It's like, no, like if you actually know their history, they're fucking nuts, a lot of them. But there's a lot of Tibetans who are in the Communist Party of China who have seen the amazing accomplishments of socialism and are making the Dalai Lama system irrelevant. I think that's the beauty of the Chinese socialist system, is like they don't even have to attack their enemy. They don't have to focus on bringing them down. They just focus on building themselves up and lifting people out of poverty with deeds, like Stalin would say, like proving the correctness of socialism with deeds. And it makes other systems irrelevant, which I think is a beautiful thing. In Xinjiang as well, the East Turkestan liberation movement, Wahhabi, Saudi-backed, crazy nut jobs who want to establish this reactionary Sharia law in Western China to ban women from, studying and going to school, and want to balkanize China. They get support from Turkey, from reactionary sectors of Turkey, from Saudis, from all these madrasas, and allied themselves also with George Bush. And a lot of people don't know some of the reactionary forces there. So I'm glad you mentioned that as well, because that's one of the ways in which U.S. imperialism tries to, in a way, subvert its own. It's like projection, right? It's like we know in the U.S. there's all these national oppression struggles against Latinos, Black, Indigenous people, but then they're portraying that onto China, and they're like, oh no, but they're the problem. It's pure hypocrisy. So what I want to do is I want to play a clip. This is from a debate between Yanis Varoufakis, a Greek Marxist. He has, I agree with a lot of things he says. There's some things I don't agree with, but he actually did a pretty decent job here, standing up and defending China against this liberal Karen type who was like, oh, but what about Chinese imperialism? So I'm going to play this clip and then get you guys' reaction, because I think this is a conversation that happens more often than not within the left.
I'm been very concerned lately about China and sort of we have transferred so much money from our economy over to China by buying all those things and supporting their economy over there so they could make more and more money. They are now all over Africa, buying things and investing over there and getting those countries dependent on them and supporting, non-democratic people. And I'm just
like
wondering,
whom?
Well,
we are in a country that supports Saudi Arabia.
Yes, that's true. Right. So
suddenly we have a problem with, superpowers supporting non-democratic people?
Yes, I do, but I also am just concerned that we've sort of created the economic power that China sort of has now, and they're using it, I fear, going to be using it against us eventually and against the better interests of a lot of people.
Allow me to put your mind to rest.
Okay, great.
You shouldn't worry about that.
Okay.
Very simple. And let me explain why you shouldn't worry about that. But please continue.
Well, I mean, they're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
To build what?
Port.
And what's wrong with that?
And well, because
countries that need ports get ports.
But they're making people dependent on. I mean, I know it's the same thing that we've done, which is
no, it's
horrible
not.
Around the world.
They are far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So.
Let me give you an example. Of course, they are peddling for influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they are non-interventionist. Absolutely non-interventionist in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom.
But I have a feeling they have a longer-term thought process that is more interventionist.
But
anyway,
let's judge what we see.
A lot there. Y'all have some funny comments. Dorian Sapien said, if they get ports, what's next? Airports? So this is a conversation. I'm sure y'all have had this debate with some of the ultras on social media who are like, but look, they're building ports. What about these highways? They're going to use them as debt and leverage. It's like China's not the U.S. China's not the World Bank. And I think people always confuse industrial development versus industrial capital versus financial capital. Like China is in the business of building ports, highways, infrastructure all over Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia, the global South. You don't see these Chinese banks like acting like the World Bank and the IMF as financial capitalists, parasitic capitalism that Lenin talks about, getting people into high interest debt and using all these financial schemes to imprison people without creating a product or something, which I think people totally fail to understand. But why don't we start off with you, compañero Carlos, your reaction to that interaction?
Well, I thought it was quite funny because it depicts one of the things. There's this section at the beginning of Roland Bohr's book that we'll be getting to later on, but he talks about like the different forms of rejection of China. And one of the ones that he describes is conspiracy theory, where it's like, it doesn't matter how much evidence you have, there's always this big fucking plot in the background that you have faith in, that there's this big plot. Even if they show you that behind the curtains, there's nothing, it has to be something. And she described that. She's like, I have this feeling that there's this big plot. It's bullshit. But you know what you're describing is something that's encompassed nicely by a Danish saying that Bohr mentions quite a few times in the book. He says, to the thief, the thief thinks everyone is also stealing. And that's what we have in the US. We have an utter projection of what we have done through the IMF and the World Bank, and how we've engaged with the third world and the predatory ways in which we have engaged with it. And that's not at all how China has engaged with it. Right? China engages in international trade with win-win aims, which means that, yes, part of it is them winning, but also the other side winning, right? It's a mutual beneficiary trade. And it's no wonder that the whole globe is turning towards China for trading, because it's the only major power that doesn't trade in a unilateral manner, as the US has done ever since the end of the Second World War. So it's ultimately hypocritical. There was a recent summit on anti-Chinese propaganda ran by the Friends of Socialist China group, which I recommend everyone watching to check out, because their stuff is absolutely fantastic. And Ben Norton did this presentation on, just the utter hypocrisy of countries like Spain and France and the US and these imperialist countries that have just colonized not just Africa but Latin America, and that have kept their people in misery to extract their resources. How they point fingers at China, but what they're really doing is just describing what they have done for years. So I think the Danish saying says it perfectly. To the thief, everyone appears to be stealing, and that's not the case with China, right? And if we ask the people they're trading with, is this how you feel about the trade? Everyone says no. We're genuinely growing, because yes, there's a part of it that's debt, but they're building the infrastructure so that they're giving them the conditions for the possibility to pay back that debt. Whereas with the loans that are taken out from the IMF and the World Bank, there's never any conditions for the country to ever be able to pay back the debt. And that's part of the understanding of the loan, that you're going to have to take these structural changes if you want to have these loans. So yeah, and the distinction you make between finance, the development of finance capital and industrial capital, I think gets at the heart of it, of why there's a difference there.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's funny, shout out to Comrade Big Teal, who's watching and listening, and said, like this, hold on, let me pull this up. This show is funny. He said, like, this lady really cares about Africa, talking about the Karen who was confronting Giannis. Yeah, it's like all of a sudden people in the US want to be like so concerned about what's going on in Africa, Asia, Latin America. Now they give a fuck. And when countries like Spain and France talk about Chinese neocolonialism, I'm like, damn, y'all have some really shitty short-term memory, because just a few decades ago, to this day, still, you know, it's just, they've just rebranded it in a much better way. They're still fucking over people. Haiti is still paying a debt to France for liberating itself from slavery and colonialism. So it's just insane. Comrade Eddie, your reaction, Comrade Eddie, you know, as somebody who has posted a lot specifically on this topic in China, defended China and Chinese socialism, I bet you have had that interaction various times. So your analysis of that clip, and how do you handle those sort of conversations when people are like, but they're building airports, you know?
Yeah, that's a hilarious clip, and I've actually shared that clip before on TikTok to show people, like, this is what you sound like sometimes. Like, and you see how vapid, like, the arguments of imperialism are. Like, you know, her argument is literally, they're all over Africa, they're investing, they're buying things and supporting non-democratic people. Like, that's literally the most meaningless, vapid statement I've ever heard in my life. There's no details, there's no specifics, and then he presses her on it, and she goes, well, they're building ports. Like, okay, like, ports are good. And, you know, like we're talking about before, Marxism deals with the concrete reality, you know, and when you press these anti-China people on, you know, what their issues are with what China is doing concretely, you know, they don't even want to go into the specifics. It's just, oh, they're supporting undemocratic people, I think. And, you know, as socialists, when you look at the position China's been placed in, you know, in being forced to construct socialism in a world where imperialism and capitalism are dominant, you know, what they've been doing with like the Belt and Road Initiative is pretty genius, you know, in helping out these other anti-imperialist countries and sort of forming a trading bloc that's opposed to the U.S. dominated financial system like the IMF and the World Bank. This is my roommate Matt, by the way. I'll just
what up, Matt?
So kind of lost my train of thought, but yeah, and the hypocrisy of imperialism too. There's a really good podcast with Radio Free Amanda is her name, where they talk about the Belt and Road Initiative specifically, and the details of these contracts that African countries sign with China are very, very similar to the Marshall Plan, which was this plan after World War II, where the European countries, allies of the United States, had suffered a lot of damage from the bombing and the fighting. Obviously, that's where a lot of the fighting went down in Europe. So the U.S. offered them these development loans at like 2% interest rates, which basically helped Europe to rebuild themselves as an ally to the U.S. with the idea, you know, the U.S. having this idea in mind of, if we have allies, they'll help us geopolitically and they'll help us economically. You know, why we can hold, or rather than extracting all of Europe's resources, we'll help them develop themselves and then they can trade with us. So China has kind of done the same thing with all these countries who the U.S. has been holding under the boot of imperialism for years. And it reminds me of something that Vijay Prashad says about China that I think is genius, is that Westerners forget that China isn't just a Marxist revolution, but a Leninist revolution. So every action that they take is in resistance to imperialism and has, you know, imperialism in mind, which, of course, in the modern era is U.S. dominated, financial capital dominated imperialism. So that's, you know, a lot of what China's trade contracts, plans, programs are designed to do, is combat imperialism.
Most definitely. I think that's a great synthesis of what Chinese socialism is. It's Marxism Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, and I think Xi Jinping. I forget how they phrase it exactly, but it's a culmination. It continues to develop, and what was kind of sad to see is how so many of the ultras, they kind of fixate on one particular era and say keep it they view it very metaphysically. They're like, okay, from this year to this year, that is the correct line, and anything before and after that is it's like, and that's the irony, is like, if Mao were alive today, he'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? Like, Marxism has to keep growing and evolving. It's like any other science, physics, chemistry, biology. You're not going to say, oh, Einstein was a revisionist, I only follow Newtonian physics, so it's like just the hypocrisy of some people on the Western left. But speaking of people on the Western left who like to support imperialist propaganda about China, in particular the Uyghur community, I want to play a clip. This is from your favorite YouTuber. I'm sure you guys know him. He's somebody who you all love and respect dearly, Vash, and I say that sarcastically. Somebody who promotes this idea that China is carrying out a quote unquote genocide of the Uyghurs, that China is horrible. Somebody who tries to act like they're on the left and is repeating State Department propaganda. I want to play this clip from his quote unquote Uyghur genocide research stream and get your reaction. This is something that, as those of us as Marxists who defend China, we get a lot of heat for. So I want to delve right into this topic. So I'm going to play this clip right now.
Using information gathered only through leaked documents from the Chinese government and official state broadcasts from the Chinese government, you can actually piece together more than enough information to make it perfectly clear that a genocide is taking place. The most charitable interpretation of what is taking place right now in the Xinjiang province in China is as follows. Over the past couple of years, a historically oppressed ethnic minority has been subjected to an astronomical rise in surveillance and policing. Not only has the government brought more police and more regulatory and surveilling programs to that region, additionally, they have enlisted literally millions of citizens in that province as essentially neighborhood watch organizers who work directly for the government, who are punished if they do not fulfill their duties, and whose job it is to be on the lookout for suspicious activity on the part of people within their region. That suspicious activity, and this is again the words of the Chinese government, does not constitute anything illegal. It does not have to involve illegal or criminal activity. It can be anything as light as being young. That's not a joke. Being young is a listed reason why it can be justified to announce that a person is suspicious and report their information to the state. Additionally, people in the Xinjiang province are forced to download an application which scans their phones for illicit or subversive material and uploads that information to servers held by the Chinese government. This is that area of the world, that area, Xinjiang, that province, is the hotbed of the cutting edge of surveillance state technology. There is, in all likelihood, no place on Earth more thoroughly surveilled. And all of this is done with the explicit intent on the part of the Chinese government to rid the Uyghur Muslim population of their extremist tendencies.
So it cut off a little bit at the end, but he said, basically accusing China of trying to rid people of their quote unquote extremist tendencies. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. By the way, Nadir Farah said, man, this guy full of lies, talking about Vash. Oliver Smith, Vash is a raging imperialist, lie to the moon, saying he's another bootlicker, lieutenant of the State Department. Big Teal, not this guy, his lack of history and clear political ideology that can assist socialist projects gives me a headache. And this guy is somebody who has fucking hundreds of thousands of followers and all this stuff. So he's somebody who is really discussing and just repeating a lot of this State Department propaganda. Before I pass it over to you, comrades, to react, one thing that I think stands out to me is the fact, he talks about surveillance. And here's the thing, right? At the same time, we have to admit, like, yes, there is a genuine concern among Chinese officials about groups operating in Xinjiang and among the Uyghur community. But for legitimate concern, we have to remember that for several years that there have been already numerous terrorist attacks, bombing, stabbings that have taken place in China by not everyday working class Uyghur people, but by Western-backed Uyghur Wahhabi extremists who want to establish a caliphate and want to bring Sharia law into Western China and have killed innocent people. So it's not like the Chinese government is just like, look at them practicing their religion and following their traditions. We need to go get them and kill them for no reason. And that ties in perfectly with the Western racist stereotype of Chinese people just being bloodthirsty, killing people for no reason. That's the view that people in the West have of China, that the Chinese people don't value life, that they just kill a bunch of people and for no reason. What interest would they have in just wanting to get rid of them for no reason? It doesn't make sense. So I think that's something that for me is like, yeah, if you have a group of people in one region that are getting millions of dollars from the US and are stabbing innocent people in the subway and shit, like, of course you're going to take keep an eye out on them. You know, obviously it's your natural right to self-defense. But Comrade Carlos, your reaction to that?
What we have to understand is that although this appears as a new issue, it is not new. The promotion of extremism to fight communism and socialism has been going on since the last few decades of the Cold War. And when the Soviet Union is overthrown, what the US does is shift its focus on using extremism to fight the Soviet Union, to shift it to fight China. So this is a long, broiling process, and I would recommend the listeners to check out an article, a compilation by Xiao Collective called Xinjiang, a Report and Resource Compilation. Now, one of the things that I wanted to mention is that there's so much of this information is fabricated, and they just toss so much shit at the wall. They create these institutes with these really bougie sounding objective names, Congress, the World Uyghur Congress, and Radio Free, and they create all of these plethora of institutes that are all funded from the State Department and State Department forces and arms and shit. And what they end up doing is just citing all over Western media from these institutes that a lot of them get their information from Adrian Sens. Some of them get people that come from the Uyghur diaspora, and they pay them, and then the credibility is just completely, it's been thrown off a million times. They do similar things with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. But I want to note that this isn't like just us combating information anymore. The political ends of the Uyghur narrative is something that the empire has admitted. This is a quote from, I'm going to read two quotes, one from Sybil Edmonds, who was a former interpreter with the FBI. She said that Xinjiang is the entry artery of energy. We want to gradually and internally play the gender card and the race card. For that part of the world, we want to play the minority without land. We say we are going to help them, and they are being oppressed. Chinese are gunning them down and torturing them. This was the plan. And then Lawrence Wilkerson, who is the chief of staff for the former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, said in 2018 that the third reason why we were in Afghanistan is because there are 20 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The CIA would want to destabilize China, and that would be the best way to do it, to foment unrest and to join with those Uyghurs pushing the Han Chinese in Beijing from internal places rather than external. So we know the political ends of this. And, you know, this whole repression narrative, it's so hypocritical because as one of CGTV reporter Li Jingjing, I don't know if you guys know her, her reporting is great. She mentions that the real genocide that has been, or the real culture of genocide and the real repression that has been going on in Xinjiang has been waged by the Muslim extremists, not by the government. They're the ones that have prevented the Uyghur people from expressing themselves culturally. They have prevented people from dressing in a certain way. They have prevented certain developments of traditional Uyghur music. There was a rock band that she was talking about that they were just repressing music, not allowing like the Uyghur musicians who wanted to incorporate some elements of rock music into the traditional. So they're repressing the development of Uyghur culture, and then they're repressing the freedoms that Uyghur women had won with the Chinese revolutionary process. So the real genocide, the real repression has been coming from these extremist forces that have been systematically funded by the US and not from China. What the Chinese government is doing is protecting the population against that. And poll after poll, when they ask Chinese citizens how they feel about these surveillance apparatuses, they're highly favorable of it, in the mid to high 90s. And there's a reason. They see this as creating the sort of social conditions for accountability, for safety, and for the promotion of virtue. It's a lot easier if you're, a woman or a younger person to walk in the streets at night if you realize that the robbers or the people that have bad intentions know that they're being watched, right? So it promotes this aura of safety that has been seen by the population as mostly favorable.
Yeah, no, that's 100% true. And I'm glad you mentioned the Chiao Collective. They have great resources and content debunking a lot of this claim. And for those of you who are listening, this is a map. We're looking at a map of Xinjiang within its position in China. And I think it's also important to look at this from the position of military strategy, hybrid warfare, because one of the things that China has had difficulty with is that a lot of its cities are located on this East Coast, Beijing, Shanghai. And so Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, which is part of China, which also thankfully Nicaragua, maybe later on we could talk about that. Nicaragua has just recognized the PRC as legitimate China. Taiwan right here has always been a kind of a bastion, a rock in the shoe of China as a foothold of imperialism against mainland China. And also in terms of trading oil, bringing oil to China, it has been dependent on the coast. So with the Belt and Road Initiative and the brilliance of Xi Jinping and Chinese socialism, they have begun expanding westward toward Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, building highways, building corridors of economic development, reviving the old Silk Road of the 600 and 700s and creating a new, higher version, the new Silk Road, based on socialist cooperation. And it just so happens that Xinjiang is right at the artery, right at the conduit, the main base. It's like the jugular of the Belt and Road Initiative. So having control of this area is very important for U.S. imperialism. It also borders Afghanistan, where we know that the U.S. imperialists have engaged in opiate production, and that the Sackler family and the big pharmaceuticals have been benefiting from producing opium. They would love to have Chinese people hooked on opiates again, just like in the Century of Humiliation. We know that Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan have a lot of oil production, trading with Russia and China. So geopolitically, Xinjiang is of strategic importance for the imperialists. And I think it's always important to kind of have that visual. Comrade Eddie, your reaction to some of the propaganda coming from our favorite YouTuber, Vosh, somebody who is just regurgitating State Department lies.
Yeah, no surprise to see that from Vosh there. He is a neoliberal masquerading as a socialist, as I'm sure most of your audience is already aware. But what he's talking about there with the increased surveillance, in a lot of ways is real. Like a lot of the information is fabricated and coming from Adrian's ends. But then, one of the strategies of imperialism is to always blow out of proportion things that are real. Something really goes on the ground and the U.S. blows it out of proportion and pretends it's something it's not. And that seems to be the case here. There was increased surveillance in response to these wave of terror attacks supported by the U.S., including the Urumqi riots, where over 100 people died and there were people running around with severed heads in the streets. Like, people really underestimate how horrific these terrorist attacks were. And going back to what Carlos said of this being a traditional strategy of the empire and backing these right-wing extremist groups, the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is the major extremist group backed by the West, and driving a lot of the separatists and terror attacks in Xinjiang were funded and supported by Osama bin Laden's Mujahideen, who the U.S. were arming and funding in Afghanistan when they were trying to stop Afghanistan from becoming a democratic, progressive society. So this not only, it has been continued to be supported by the U.S. as the U.S. has now taken the ETIM off of their list of terror groups, allowing the ETIM to continue recruitment. But it was also, the U.S. helped originate it. They have funded right-wing extremism all across the Muslim world for years. And there's a really good chapter of Vijay Prashad's book, Washington Bullets, called Hope Lay in the Muslim Revival. And that quote, Hope Lay in the Muslim Revival, is something that a CIA document said, because, they had said, we are going to target right-wing extremist groups, who are against socialism, against, progressive governments or ideals, against these countries developing themselves, in order to make sure that the U.S. maintains dominance in that region. And, now we're just seeing the latest iteration of that. But the left has the American left has no problem looking back historically and being like, yeah, funding the Mujahideen was bad. But, when it comes to modern events, and modern lies of the empire, it's much harder for these same people who can say the funding of the Mujahideen was bad to say the U.S. backing of the ETIM to destabilize China is bad. And they go right along with the propaganda. And, that's something I always say is everyone's an anti-imperialist in hindsight, right? Everyone's an anti-imperialist 20 years later when we find out that the CIA was lying to us. But when the CIA is lying to us about Xinjiang, it's much tougher. And Carlos recommended the Chow Collective. Another one that I would recommend is Daniel Dumbrill. He lives in Shenzhen, China, and he takes trips to Xinjiang. He's also taken trips to Tibet. And he has these interviews where he interviews different spokespeople for the ETIM who are connected to the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is an arm of the U.S. State Department. And he gets them to say things like, they don't support women leaving the house without their husband's permission, or, they want laws that force women to cover a certain portion of their body. And you see what this is. It's just the NED and the State Department backing these right-wing people who want to destabilize China in order to destabilize China. And also just some of the reports that come out about Xinjiang are just absurd. There's a CNN report that says that China harvested 13 tons of Uyghur hair. They took a shipment that was leaving China. It was filled with wigs. They assumed that it was Uyghur hair harvested in forced labor camps and reported that all over the U.S. media. Harvesting 13 tons of hair would take like 100 years. Hair is so light, it would be almost impossible to have forced labor camps where you harvest 13 tons of hair. But they just run these stories to create this general idea about China that they're, basically comic book villains.
Wow, that's crazy. And the crazy, it reminds me of the fake stories that come out about the DPRK, that all these crazy stuff that everybody has to get the same haircut and all this nonsense and propaganda that they say about the DPRK. And as long as, because of lingering racism as well, people will believe it. They'll say, wow, these people are crazy. They're just barbaric. They're this or that. And it's really disgusting to see how the U.S. imperialists lie about China so openly and nobody. And I'm really glad you mentioned that people are anti-imperialists in hindsight, because I remember, I don't know if you guys remember this, but in 2013, when Obama was president still, there was so much talk around Syria, and everything was Assad is gassing his own people. Assad is gassing his own people, chemical weapons. And around that time period, I was already becoming a communist, but it was interesting to see so many people on the left who believed it, who they were like, neither Damascus nor Washington, or they were kind of pulling that shit, right? And they were saying like, oh, but democracy now said it, so it must be real, right? And it's like so much propaganda and lies about Assad and chemical weapons, which doesn't even make sense. Why the fuck would he just wake up one day and decide to gas and attack his own people for no reason and try to get away with it? And then I remember, I don't know if you guys remember this as well, but there was that image of that young boy in Syria who was covered in dust, and covered in smoke. And CNN and MSNBC and all these imperialist outlets are like, oh my God, this poor boy, we have to go in and save them. And the US has to save the Syrian people. And people fell for it hook, line, and sinker. It turns out that that whole shit was staged, that somebody put him there, and his family was Assad supporters. That it wasn't even the Assad government that was doing that, it was the opposition, and that they totally warped that whole narrative to serve the aims of imperialism. And it's nothing new. We've seen that as well with the Gulf War, right? With that girl who was saying that the babies in the incubators were thrown out, and it was revealed that she was working for some high royal family and intelligence. So all these, and the second I say that, people, all these like soy liberals like Vosh, they're like, here we go, conspiracy theory. It's like, no, dude, like that shit happens all the time, bro. Like psychological operations, they do that shit in order to justify war, because the best way that imperialism can justify war is tapping into empathy, tapping into the emotions you have. And by creating this narrative, right? Because the US is not gonna have support for war if they're like, we need to squash China and go in there and show them who's boss in America. That doesn't work anymore. So now you have to pull on the heartstrings of the masses and be like, look, these people are dying, and if we don't go and save them, more are gonna die. Do you want blood on your hands? And that's exactly what they're doing with China. So and as Joe, the Euro squatter, said, the little girl was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, IIRC. Yeah, and it's just like, that shit is crazy, because it's something that is completely introduced, used so many times throughout history. But what I want to do, just to kind of wrap up here, it's been really dope speaking with you, Conrad, so far. What I want to do is I want to share this quick excerpt from, thanks again to Comrade Gadlos, who shared this, from Roland Boer. This is from Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, a guide for foreigners. And this is, I want to read an excerpt from this and kind of wrap up here talking about China and socialism. So in this section, chapter 1, Marxism as China's special skill, he says, the best way to understand China and its path is through Chinese Marxism. It is as simple and as complex as that. I should hardly need to point out that the need to understand China's path grows by the day, especially as its rejuvenation gathers pace and hits ever new targets. In light of the situation, it seems as though nearly everyone in the world now has opinion on China, no matter whether they know anything about the place or not. But what soon becomes apparent amongst all the various opinions and indeed scholarly works from other parts of the world is that very few of them pay any attention to Chinese Marxism, or indeed socialism with Chinese characteristics. Even less are prepared to devote themselves to the arduous but rewarding task of studying what Chinese Marxist scholars themselves have to say about China's path. This is precisely what I do in this book. I offer a careful presentation on socialism with Chinese characteristics in light of the research undertaken by Chinese Marxist scholars, research that has been overwhelmingly published in the Chinese language. In light of this research, it is quite very that China is vigorously following the socialist road, and that Marxism is in the driver's seat on that road. So let us plunge straight in and see what it means for Marxism to be the core and center of the Chinese project. Marxism, especially Marxist philosophy, is regarded as China's, quote, special skill. This is from Xi Jinping. The four-character Chinese term, I'm going to butcher this, Kanjia Ben Ling, means a stock in trade, a special knack, a particular honed skill that one has for literally looking after the home. Just one more excerpt from here. Some may be surprised, Marxism as China's special skill. Some may be surprised how can it be that a major global power has Marxist philosophy as its special skill. Not merely philosophy, which may seem surprising enough in itself, but Marxist philosophy. Obviously, we need to dig deeper. So I will examine three interrelated texts by none other than Xi Jinping. The first concerns the central role of Marxist philosophy and the social sciences. The second deals with dialectical materialism. And the third concerns historical materialism. The first has become a much referenced landmark text, initially delivered as a speech at a major forum on philosophy and the social sciences in May of 2016. And then Roland goes into defining Marxist philosophy. Let me just read this last paragraph before we wrap up. Defining Marxist philosophy. The answer appears in the two other pieces mentioned. Marxist philosophy entails dialectical materialism as its method and historical materialism as its application. This is a mainstream definition of Marxist philosophy, which has its roots in Marx and Engels, was explicitly identified in Soviet Marxism, and has been developed further in Chinese Marxism. You will find some in a few small corners of the world suggesting that only, quote, historical materialism is appropriate, but this is a view from a small tributary and not the mainstream. As for dialectical materialism, and here he cites Xi Jinping, it entails four key propositions. One, the world is unified in matter and matter determines consciousness, so policies should be developed in light of objective reality. Two, since the movement of contradictions is a determining feature of matter, one should strengthen one's awareness of such contradictions and seek to resolve them. Three, the fundamental method of materialist dialectics is to think dialectically and develop the ability to deal with complex situations and problems. Four, theory has a crucial role. Think of Marxist theory in terms of the dialectical relationship between knowledge and practice, but theoretical innovation should always be based on practice and on seeking truth from facts. In sum, as a method, dialectical materialism is concerned with the inherent contradictions in matter, nature, and human society, with the need for dialectical analysis of such contradictions, so to develop appropriate theories, policies, and programs, including those of governance and economic planning. So he talks about this again. This is from Roland Bohr's book, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics for International Audience, for Foreign Audience. Wrapping up here, Comrade Carlos, your thoughts on this book, any other resources that you suggest people check out to understand Chinese socialism, socialism with Chinese characteristics?
Well, this book is fantastic, and the author is someone I personally look up to. There's not many Marxist-Leninist philosophers in the Anglophone world. There's a lot of the armchair Western academics, but not a lot of, the real deal people. And he's one of them. And the book is just fantastic. It's a mixture of both an encyclopedia that shows you the history, the structural developments and the theoretical developments in the Chinese Revolution, but it also does so in a very in-depth manner, which is not something you usually get from encyclopedic text. They just give you a bunch of stuff and not very in-depth. He goes very in-depth into it. And as someone who's a Marxist, Leninist philosopher, it's just fascinating that what we have in the West, in the humanities in general, but in philosophy in particular, is just a complete underfunding. And what China's doing now, ever since like 2015, is realizing that now's the time to develop culturally as well. So they're promoting journals, institutes dedicated to Marxist research. And the Marxist research is not just done for the sake of publishing so that you can get a nice little job in academia. It's research that's oriented towards making the lives of the people better. The philosophers are in the world, and their purpose is to make the world better, to change the world. So I think that's fascinating. And one of the things that Roland Bohr, reading his text, led me to realize is that the developments that have came about theoretically in China, I think, have been the biggest advance in Marxist theory in the 20th century. Just the analysis of contradiction analysis and the development of a theory of socialist markets is just phenomenal, and it has inspired most revolutions which have had similar conditions as the one in China, whose central contradiction was the question of land. But I recommend everyone to read it. It's a difficult text to access because it's like $80, and I had a bootleg copy that I've been sharing around. So Roland Bohr is a comrade, so I imagine he won't be too mad. But yeah, I'm trying to think of what else I wanted to mention, but it's slipping me now.
Yeah. Any other like resources or any other advice for somebody who maybe comes from that position, that ultra position? I'll be honest with you. I had that position myself when I was first getting into communism. I was like, how's China communist? Like, it has roads and markets. How, any advice for somebody like that who is curious to learn, has that element of curiosity about Chinese socialism, in particular, Chinese sources of information? Like, I would suggest Beijing Review, as well as a great magazine that has stuff.
Yeah, I think there's like three in English. I know one of them is Kishi. I'm forgetting the name of the other two, but one of the advices that he gives is big ears, little mouth. Listen more and talk less. And
Yeah.
you know that we're talking about a population of 1.4 billion people who are homegrown in a socialist society, and in terms of academics, who are homegrown in a socialist society aimed at developing Marxism for the sake of constructing socialism. The thing I wanted to mention that I think it's important and it shows its distinction. Boer talks about a conference that he went to on the October Revolution, and he saw a split that I think is very important, which is that the people from the West were focusing on the pre-revolutionary period, the writings of Lenin before the revolution. What the Chinese Marxists are concerned with is the more difficult part of a revolutionary process, which is constructing socialism. So their questions were all aimed at, well, how was Lenin dealing with the contradictions that arose after the revolution? How was Stalin dealing with these contradictions? So there's so much to learn from that. And the fact that we just, Marxists in general in the West, just push it aside because of the biases that he talks about in the beginning, the various biases that don't let people understand China. It's a shame. So the main tip I would give is big ears, little mouth. There's so much to learn from it. And even if you're well read in Marxism, you're going to understand some of the basic stuff, but you're going to be in awe with how much new things they have been able to create. And that's been my experience.
Great advice. I like that saying, big ears, little mouth, because there's some people who are fucking annoying and like just they are so arrogant and don't have the humility to be like, I have more to learn. Dude, there's so many. I just finished volume 1 of Capital this year. It took me a year to finish it. I still have volumes 2 and 3 left to read. And there's so much information that even though I read volume 1 so slowly and carefully, there were some terms and concept that I know, like if I went back to it, I would have trouble. So just the humility to be like, yeah, I don't know everything right now. There's still so much I have to learn. And also through practice that the Chinese socialists, the communists are building socialism in reality, in practice, in real life, in the material world. It's not some Sims video game where it's all theoretical. Like, see what they're doing now, see their accomplishments, and base it off of that. Comrade Eddie, your final thoughts, advice for young people wanting to learn about Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, and any advice you have for them.
Yeah, I mean, since we're recommending resources, I'll do a little self plug here. I just shared in the chat a video that I made on the construction of modern China. And I like what you said about the need to understand China is increasing in importance because of the role that China plays on the global stage. You know, and we can see this with the shift of imperialism towards focusing on China and this new Cold War. You know, the U.S. is putting all their eggs in one basket of trying to destroy China. Because China is this socialist bulwark against imperialism. So it's increasingly important for socialists elsewhere to understand that, you know, especially in a globalized world. And, you know, I also would recommend learning about China from people in China, from Chinese Marxist academics, from Xi Jinping, because they're actually in the process of constructing socialism. Like Carlos says, our friend Caleb Maupin, who, you know, of course we have some disagreements with, but something he says that I really like is don't read French philosophers if you want to learn about Marxism in the modern era. Read Xi Jinping, because China is applying Marxism in the modern era. And, you know, that's the thing. Marxism develops from practice. It does not just develop in the human mind. And when you read these, the debate within the Chinese party, you see how much, as Carlos mentioned, they learned from the USSR. They learned from Vietnam. They learned from Yugoslavia. Every single socialist experiment ever, they're learning from. What did they do right? What did they do wrong? You know, and it's you see that's how Marxism develops, you know, is through practice. Marxism is a method of analysis for understanding the material reality, right? It's not something that philosophers can just think about, or, you know, sit around and think about and expand that way. It's something that grows and develops through practice, and that's what China's doing right now with the construction of socialism. So yeah, learn about China and learn about it from people who are there, who are in the struggle, and have an open mind. Yeah.
Most definitely. Well said, Conrad, Eddie. Also, here's the video for those of you who are listening. Please check out this video, Imperialism and the Construction of Modern China, featuring artsy Marxists on Midwestern Marx. Great channel. By the way, congrats on 20K subs, man. That's an amazing accomplishment. We need more communist channels like yours that are putting amazing content out there. Not the CIA-backed fucking Vosh shitty channels that are not even communist, but real actual. And I know it's all grassroots. I know I've seen it grow. I've been following you guys' channel for some time, and it's organic. There's a community. Like, there's no bots, there's no paid shit. You know, it's because sometimes you go to like these weird breadtube channels and you look at the people commenting and you're like, yo, who the fuck are these people? And it's just like the most odd names. Like, you look at our channels and it's like real people, you know, like with real stories. So I definitely appreciate the work that y'all do. And I think another thing that I really appreciate about you, the work that you guys do, is that you guys are very principled and comradely in how you agree and disagree. I think a lot of times people get so dug into their heels and dogmatic about taking certain positions. And I think that's so bad for the left because, like I mentioned at the beginning of the stream, like, it's okay to have disagreements with people and still be comrades, still be friends, still work together. This is what the Chinese Communist Party is doing today. And I think so many people in the Western left treat it like a sports team, or like they're like, oh, I'm this, I'm that. And it's like, no, like, you know, let's focus on the problem. Let's combat imperialism. Let's unite around that. And we should always unite around the things we have in common rather than just focusing on these minor divisions that are useless to argue about. So I do appreciate that you guys do a very professional, revolutionary job in terms of not even getting into dumb drama and shit like that. Because I think that's another thing that really the imperialists love is sowing division. And so I just wanted to give you guys a shout out for that, because I know it's something that is hard to do, especially now. But yo, it's been really an honor speaking with you, comrades. We spoke with our guests were Compañero Carlos Garrido, a Cuban-American philosophy graduate student and instructor at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. His research focuses on Marxism, Hegel, and early 19th century U.S. socialism, and editor and co-founder Midwestern Marx and the Journal of American Socialist Studies. Links to both are in the description. And also Comrade Eddie Liger Smith, an American political scientist and specialist in anti-imperialist and socialist projects, especially Venezuela. He has research interests in the role Southern slavery played in the development of American and European capitalism. Wonderful topic. I'd love to speak with you about that sometime, because I think that's something that unfortunately many people are forgetting about. He's currently a graduate student, assistant, and wrestling coach, so he'll fuck all the reactionaries up if you try to mess with Eddie. Brolick at University of Wisconsin Platteville. He's an editor, co-founder, Midwestern Marx and Journal of American Social Studies. You guys are great, man. I'd love to have you on sometime again soon. And thanks again for having me on your channel to talk about the socialist victory in Nicaragua and in Honduras. Exciting stuff. Maybe in the future we can do a follow-up stream about Latin America and socialism. Please subscribe to the channel, Midwestern Marx. Congrats on 20K. Shout out to all the Midwestern Marx fans out there. Also check them out on TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and all that good stuff. Peace out, comrades. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you all. We're going to go out to some revolutionary music from the Chinese Red Army, the Internationale. Peace out, everybody. Peace, Carlos. Peace, Eddie. And everybody who's watching and listening. Take care, everybody.